When a nation chooses to stand firm in principle, it is doing something that has psychological and moral weight far beyond politics. To stand firm means to say, I will not bend my identity, my history, and my values to the pressure of others. This is the same lesson every individual faces when confronted by forces that try to control or belittle them. If you give in, you lose not just the battle, but the very structure that makes you who you are. Nations are like individuals in this sense. If they betray their own values to gain temporary favor, they hollow themselves out. India, in this situation, has refused to be hollowed out. It has refused to abandon its identity to appease the demands of external powers. That refusal is not arrogance, though many will attempt to brand it as such. It is integrity, and integrity is far rarer and far more powerful than popularity. Consider the psychological impact of principle. A principle is not a whim, it is not a short-term preference. It is a line drawn in the sand that says, beyond this, I will not move. For an individual, principles are the only thing that guard against chaos. Without them, one drifts, always bending to external pressure, always sacrificing stability for the temporary approval of others. Nations that lack principle find themselves in endless cycles of weakness and dependency. But India, by standing firm, has demonstrated to the world that it understands something fundamental, that without principle there can be no sovereignty, and without sovereignty there can be no dignity. Dignity cannot be borrowed from another's approval. It must be created by one's own stance, and that stance is always tested under the fire of confrontation. Every human life mirrors this conflict. You will be pressured to conform, to bend, to submit to others' expectations. It happens in classrooms, workplaces, families, and nations. And each time, the temptation is to think that if you surrender just a little, you will gain peace. But surrender does not bring peace. It brings dependency. Dependency breeds resentment, and resentment slowly turns to despair. To avoid despair, one must cultivate the courage to resist when resistance is necessary, and resistance always carries a cost. That cost is the loss of approval, the discomfort of conflict, and the loneliness of standing alone. But the alternative, the erosion of your character, is infinitely worse. Nations know this, and so do individuals who choose to live truthfully. India's refusal to bend to American attempts at isolation is a kind of psychological victory for the human spirit. It is the triumph of stability over chaos, identity over compromise. To stand up to a larger power is not merely about survival. It is about proving that principles matter more than intimidation. There is a deep lesson here for every person listening. You may not control the size of your opponent, but you do control the depth of your principles. If they are shallow, you will collapse at the first sign of pressure. If they are deep, then no matter how large the storm, you will remain anchored. Anchors hold ships steady not by size, but by depth, and principles serve exactly that role for nations and individuals alike. India has revealed the depth of its anchor, and the world has noticed. Think about what it means to be pressured by an external force that believes it has the right to dictate your choices. This is not only a political problem, it is a psychological reality we all face. Bosses, institutions, even family members can attempt to isolate you into compliance. They threaten to cut you off from approval, opportunities, or resources if you refuse to obey. But in that moment, you are faced with a test. Do you collapse into obedience, or do you withstand the pressure? To withstand requires strength, and strength is never free. It must be cultivated through discipline, honesty, and a willingness to suffer the consequences of integrity. Those who have cultivated that strength inspire others, because people instinctively recognize the nobility of resistance. It is also crucial to recognize that standing firm does not guarantee immediate victory. In fact, it often brings temporary loss. India faced criticism, skepticism, and hostility. Similarly, in your own life, standing firm may bring rejection or ridicule. But short-term losses are often the price of long-term freedom. Without paying that price, you are enslaved to the will of others. What India shows us is that enduring the short-term hostility of powerful forces is sometimes necessary to secure long-term sovereignty. For individuals, this means sacrificing the comfort of conformity for the greater reward of self-respect. The humiliation of temporary defeat pales in comparison to the destruction caused by permanent submission. That is the deeper psychological truth beneath this political moment. Another point to consider is that principle requires courage precisely because it is not guaranteed to be rewarded. Integrity is not a strategy for popularity, it is a strategy for survival of the soul. Nations that betray their principles often gain momentary approval but lose themselves. Individuals who betray their principles may gain short-term advantage but end up hollow, bitter, and weak. Courage in the face of external power is therefore not about the outcome. It is about preserving the structure of being itself. If you abandon principle, you destroy the foundation upon which you stand. Without foundation, you cannot withstand any storm, no matter how small. With foundation, you can survive storms that seem insurmountable. That is the paradox of principle. It seems fragile, but it is the only thing that makes strength possible. India's choice also highlights a deeper cultural and historical truth. A nation with thousands of years of civilizational history cannot afford to bend to momentary pressures. It must act in continuity with its traditions, values, and collective memory. Similarly, individuals must live in continuity with their conscience, their deepest beliefs, and their moral compass. When you abandon that, you are severed from your own past, and without the past, the present loses meaning. A man without principle is like a tree without roots. He may stand for a while, but the first wind will topple him. India, by standing firm, has revealed the depth of its roots, and that rootedness makes it far harder to shake, no matter how great the power attempting to move it. This is the same truth that must be applied to every human life. The temptation, always, is to mistake principle for stubbornness. Critics will say that refusing to bend is arrogance, that compromise is maturity, and that resistance is hostility. But this is a dangerous distortion. True maturity is the ability to distinguish between compromise on trivial matters and refusal to compromise on fundamental truths. To compromise on truth is to corrupt yourself, and corruption spreads quickly. Once you allow it in one area, it will infect everything else. Nations that compromise their sovereignty do not lose it in one blow. They lose it gradually, piece by piece, until there is nothing left. The same is true of individuals who compromise their principles. They wake up one day hollow, enslaved, and unsure of how they lost themselves. This is why integrity must be guarded at all costs. The ultimate lesson here is that standing firm in principle transforms isolation into a form of power. When others cannot sway you, they are forced to respect you. Respect, unlike approval, cannot be demanded. It must be earned through demonstration of strength. India has demonstrated that strength, and now it commands attention rather than pleading for it. Every individual has the same opportunity in their personal lives. You cannot force people to approve of you, but you can force them to respect you by standing firm. That respect often comes reluctantly, after conflict and hostility, but it comes nonetheless. And in the long run, respect is far more valuable than shallow approval. Strength emerges not from the shallow pool of external approval, but from the deep reservoir of self-reliance. Approval is seductive because it feels like safety. It reassures us that others accept us, that we are moving in the right direction. But approval is fickle. It is given today and taken tomorrow, dependent on moods, trends, and shifting interests. If your identity is tied to approval, then your life is built on sand, and the first wave will sweep it away. Self-reliance, however, is a foundation of rock. It is built on discipline, competence, and a willingness to take responsibility. This is why India's strength did not emerge from being liked by powerful nations. It emerged from its capacity to survive and thrive without their validation. The same truth applies to every individual. When you live for the approval of others, you become a slave to their expectations. Your sense of worth is outsourced, dependent on the whims of people who may not even care about your well-being. And the danger is that once you receive approval, you will crave it again, just like an addict chasing the next fix. This dependency erodes freedom because you no longer act from principle, you act from fear of rejection. Self-reliance is the antidote. When you are competent enough to stand on your own, then approval becomes irrelevant. You may receive it, and that's fine, but you don't need it to survive. That independence is the mark of true strength, both for nations and individuals. Consider the way children grow. At first, they rely entirely on the approval of parents for direction and identity. But if they never outgrow that need, they remain dependent and fragile. True maturity begins when they start to take responsibility for themselves, when their choices are guided not by constant parental approval, but by their own competence. Nations follow the same trajectory. If they are always looking to external powers for approval, they remain in a kind of adolescence. India has shown what adulthood looks like on the world stage, standing without begging, deciding without apology, and building without permission. And that example is one every person must internalize if they are to truly grow. Self-reliance is not arrogance, and this must be clarified. Arrogance says, I don't need anyone, and I am better than everyone. Self-reliance says, I can survive on my own, and therefore I can engage with others freely. The arrogant person resists all cooperation. The self-reliant person chooses cooperation rather than needing it. India's refusal to chase approval was not arrogance. It was a declaration of capability. In the same way, when an individual stops begging for recognition, they do not withdraw from society. Instead, they participate from a position of strength, because they know that their survival does not depend on constant validation. That distinction is the dividing line between weakness and resilience. There is also a psychological dimension to this truth. When you are dependent on approval, you live in anxiety, constantly scanning for signs of acceptance or rejection. Anxiety consumes energy, weakens decision-making, and distorts identity. But when you are self-reliant, the anxiety dissolves because you no longer fear rejection. You know you can endure without it, and so you stop bending yourself into shapes to satisfy others. This is why nations that seek approval from stronger powers often act with insecurity, while nations that rely on their own strength carry themselves with dignity. That dignity is not given, it is earned, and once it is earned, it cannot be easily taken away. There is an old truth that competence is the only path to freedom. Approval without competence is worthless because it vanishes the moment you fail to please. Competence, however, guarantees that you can survive regardless of others' opinions. India's capacity to rely on its own resources, its own intelligence, and its own systems made approval unnecessary. That same rule governs personal life. If you are competent in your craft, then even if no one praises you, you will survive and eventually thrive. The applause may come later, but it is not the goal. It is a byproduct. The goal is to be capable, to be prepared, and to be disciplined enough that no external rejection can destroy you. That is where true freedom begins. Notice also how dependency on approval creates manipulation. When someone knows you need their validation, they can control you. Nations use this tactic, corporations use it, and individuals use it in relationships. If you crave approval, you are easily exploited because your weakness is exposed. But when you stand in self-reliance, you are unshakable. Manipulation fails because there is nothing to hold against you. This is why India's refusal to beg for acceptance shocked its critics. They could not control what they could not manipulate. And this is why individuals who stop chasing validation suddenly command respect. People cannot toy with someone who doesn't need their approval. The pursuit of approval is also linked to mediocrity. If your aim is to please everyone, you will water down your values, compromise your standards, and silence your voice. Nations that chase universal approval lose their sovereignty. Individuals who chase universal approval lose their identity. But when you stop aiming for approval and start aiming for competence, something remarkable happens. You may not be liked by everyone, but you will be respected by those who matter. And in the long run, respect is far more valuable than approval because it is rooted in recognition of genuine strength. India did not earn the world's respect by chasing it. It earned it by standing firm in self-reliance. It is also worth recognizing that self-reliance is a burden. It demands effort, sacrifice, and responsibility. Approval is easy. You just bend and others reward you temporarily. But self-reliance requires that you face failure, endure criticism, and carry the consequences of your choices. It is not comfortable, but it is real. India took on that burden by refusing to rely on external validation. In the same way, every person must accept that carrying responsibility is the price of independence. The comfort of approval is shallow and fleeting, but the burden of self-reliance builds strength that lasts. And that strength is the only thing that can sustain you when the world inevitably turns hostile. There is a paradox here worth emphasizing. The moment you stop seeking approval, you often begin to receive it. People admire those who don't beg for recognition because it signals confidence and stability. Nations that refuse to be desperate are often respected more than those that constantly plead for acceptance. Individuals who walk with self-reliance often attract genuine relationships, while those who chase approval attract manipulation and false praise. This paradox means that strength brings recognition more reliably than chasing recognition ever will. India's experience illustrates this truth, and each of us can apply it in our lives. You do not gain respect by chasing it. You gain it by becoming strong enough not to need it. Adversity is the great revealer of character. It strips away the illusions of comfort, the pretenses of popularity, and exposes what truly lies within. When America and its allies attempted to isolate India, they believed that pressure would create weakness. But pressure often has the opposite effect. It transforms weakness into strength by demanding resilience. India's response was not to retreat, but to reinforce itself, to take the adversity and use it as fuel for empowerment. This is a principle that applies directly to human life as well. The times when you feel excluded, rejected, or abandoned are precisely the times when your deepest character is forged. The absence of support is not the end. It is the invitation to rise. Think about the nature of isolation. At first, it feels like punishment, like a stripping away of connection and belonging. But isolation can also be the crucible in which identity is refined. A person who is never alone never discovers who they really are, because their existence is always mediated through others. A nation that always bends to alliances never finds its authentic voice, because it survives only by echoing others' expectations. India's so-called isolation became empowerment because it discovered its ability to act independently. The same is true for the individual. Rejection becomes an opportunity to cultivate inner strength, provided you are willing to face the discomfort. Isolation can destroy you, but it can also shape you into something indestructible. Life itself guarantees that adversity will come. It is not a question of if, but of when, and when it does, it places a mirror in front of you, reflecting the truth of your preparedness. If you are shallow, adversity will shatter you. If you are deep, adversity will sharpen you. India was tested in this way, and the result was a demonstration of resilience. It did not collapse into dependency. It transformed rejection into opportunity. Every person faces smaller versions of this test. When excluded from a group, when betrayed by friends, or when denied recognition, you are given a choice, to despair or to grow. And if you choose growth, then adversity ceases to be punishment and becomes a teacher. Adversity has a paradoxical nature. It feels like a threat, but it often delivers a gift. The gift is the discovery of strength you did not know you possessed. You cannot know the depth of your endurance until it is tested. You cannot know the breadth of your courage until fear surrounds you. Nations learn this in times of crisis. Individuals learn it in moments of pain. India's supposed isolation revealed its capacity to withstand pressure, to form alliances on its own terms, and to continue growing. Similarly, personal rejection can force you to rely on your own skills and build an independent life. The pain of exclusion can become the foundation of power, if you have the courage to see it that way. It is crucial to recognize that adversity reveals not only strength, but also weakness. When pressure comes, the cracks in the structure become visible. This is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity for repair. A nation discovers where it is vulnerable, and a person discovers where they must grow. If India had collapsed under pressure, it would have revealed dependency, and that would have been a lesson too. Instead, it revealed competence, and that lesson inspired the world. For the individual, the humiliations of rejection reveal the areas where competence is lacking. You cannot control whether the world accepts you, but you can control whether you build yourself strong enough to stand regardless. That is the true power hidden inside adversity. Isolation also removes illusions. When you are supported by others, it is easy to believe that your strength comes from within, when in fact it is borrowed. But when you are cut off, the truth becomes clear. You must survive by your own competence or not at all. This moment is terrifying, but it is also liberating. Nations that survive isolation emerge stronger because they know they are not dependent. Individuals who endure loneliness emerge wiser because they discover their own capacity for resilience. India's strength became undeniable once it proved it could withstand exclusion. Likewise, your strength becomes undeniable when you discover that you can survive without the approval or assistance you once thought essential. Adversity also generates creativity. When resources are limited, when support is withdrawn, you are forced to think differently, to innovate, and to create new pathways. Comfort dulls creativity because it allows you to rely on old habits. Struggle sharpens it because it forces you to see new possibilities. India, under pressure, found ways to expand its alliances, increase its economic independence, and prove its worth on the global stage. In the same way, when life isolates you, you often discover talents and solutions you would never have developed otherwise. The pain of being cut off becomes the spark of transformation. Innovation is often the child of adversity, not the product of ease. There is also a moral lesson in adversity. It reveals whether you are willing to betray your values to escape discomfort. Many people, when faced with rejection, immediately compromise who they are to regain acceptance. Nations sometimes do the same, sacrificing sovereignty to regain favor. But integrity that bends under pressure is no integrity at all. India's refusal to abandon its values under external pressure demonstrated moral strength. Each individual must ask, will I betray myself to be accepted, or will I endure rejection to remain true? Adversity poses this question relentlessly, and how you answer defines the trajectory of your life. The world respects those who endure isolation without corruption. Adversity is therefore not something to be sought, but neither is it something to be feared. It is inevitable, and it is meaningful. The meaning lies in the way it transforms. Without adversity, nations stagnate and individuals remain immature. With adversity, growth becomes possible, even unavoidable. India's so-called isolation became its stage for transformation. Your personal isolation can serve the same purpose if you see it not as an end but as an opening. That shift in perspective, from punishment to opportunity, is the defining move. Once you learn to see rejection and exclusion as chances to grow, you cease to fear them. And in that freedom from fear, real empowerment begins. The humiliation in this situation did not belong to India, but to America. And that is an important truth. Arrogance carries the seeds of its own downfall. When someone believes they are too powerful to be resisted, they often overlook the quiet strength of discipline and resilience. Arrogance blinds because it assumes that force will always produce obedience, but discipline humbles arrogance because discipline refuses to yield even when pressured. Nations that cultivate discipline in their institutions, their culture, and their people cannot be humiliated easily. Individuals who cultivate discipline in their habits and character cannot be broken easily either. The collapse of arrogance is always inevitable when it collides with the quiet endurance of disciplined strength. And this pattern repeats itself across history and across human lives. Discipline is underestimated because it is not dramatic. It does not shout or posture or demand recognition. Discipline simply endures day after day, action after action, building strength that becomes unshakable. Arrogance, on the other hand, is loud and impressive in the short term. It promises domination, but it lacks the foundations to last. India's disciplined approach, measured, patient, and steady, contrasted sharply with the arrogant assumption that it would crumble under pressure. This is why the humiliation was not India's, and the same applies to individuals. Arrogance collapses quickly when confronted by someone who has quietly cultivated discipline over years. That kind of strength is not visible until it is tested, but when the test comes, it cannot be ignored. Consider the psychology of arrogance. It thrives on illusions of superiority, on the belief that one is untouchable. But illusions dissolve when confronted with reality, and reality always favors the disciplined because discipline aligns you with truth. You cannot fake discipline. You cannot pretend to be competent or resilient for long. The arrogant often confuse bluster with strength, but bluster evaporates when pressure intensifies. Discipline, however, becomes stronger under pressure because it has been built through hardship already. This is why arrogant nations are humiliated by disciplined ones, and arrogant people are humbled by disciplined individuals. Strength is not in the performance, it is in the preparation. India prepared, and arrogance was exposed. Discipline is also rooted in humility, which makes it even more powerful. A humble person recognizes limitations, works steadily to overcome them, and refuses to take shortcuts. A humble nation recognizes its challenges, addresses them with patience, and builds resilience through effort. Arrogance denies limitations, pretends problems don't exist, and demands shortcuts that ultimately fail. India's humility before its own challenges allowed it to build genuine competence. America's arrogance blinded it to the reality of India's resilience. This is the same in life. The arrogant student may boast of talent, but the humble student who practices daily will surpass him. Arrogance may shine briefly, but discipline always endures. That is why arrogance falls and discipline triumphs. The humiliation of arrogance is therefore not an accident. It is a law of nature. Whenever arrogance collides with discipline, discipline wins. This is because arrogance is reactive, always dependent on controlling others, while discipline is proactive, always dependent on controlling oneself. Nations that rely on arrogance attempt to dominate. Nations that rely on discipline attempt to grow. Individuals who rely on arrogance attempt to impress. Individuals who rely on discipline attempt to improve. And improvement always outlasts impression. The collapse of arrogance may look sudden, but it has always been inevitable. The steady rise of discipline may look slow, but it is always unstoppable. That is why arrogance collapses in humiliation and discipline rises in victory. Discipline also requires sacrifice, which is why it is rare. People prefer the comfort of arrogance because it costs nothing in the short term. But comfort breeds weakness, and weakness invites humiliation. Discipline demands effort, consistency, and delayed gratification, but these sacrifices create unshakable foundations. India sacrificed ease for endurance, and that endurance paid off. In the same way, every person must sacrifice comfort if they want strength. You cannot have resilience without effort. You cannot have competence without repetition. And you cannot have freedom without discipline. Arrogance promises freedom without sacrifice, but it delivers collapse. Discipline promises hardship, but it delivers sovereignty, whether for nations or for individuals. It is also important to see how discipline multiplies over time. Each small act of discipline compounds into greater strength, greater resilience, and greater influence. Arrogance, however, decays over time because it resists correction. An arrogant nation ignores its mistakes until they become crises. A disciplined nation corrects itself steadily and avoids collapse. An arrogant individual refuses criticism and stagnates. A disciplined individual learns from every mistake and grows stronger. This is why arrogance often looks impressive in the short term, but collapses in shame later. Discipline often looks modest in the short term, but triumphs in the long run. Time is always on the side of discipline, never on the side of arrogance. Humiliation, in this sense, becomes a form of justice. It is the natural consequence of arrogance refusing to align with reality. Nations that attempt to dominate others often end up exposing their own weaknesses. People who boast of strength often reveal their fragility under real pressure. India did not humiliate America by design. It simply held its ground with discipline, and the arrogance of its opponent collapsed under its own weight. That is how truth works. If you align with truth through discipline, you cannot be humiliated for long. If you live in lies through arrogance, humiliation is inevitable. This is a law as real as gravity, and it applies equally to global politics and personal life. The final lesson is that discipline not only defeats arrogance, but also inspires respect. People do not respect arrogance for long because it rings hollow. They may fear it temporarily, but fear does not last. Respect lasts, and respect is always earned through discipline. Nations that demonstrate discipline in their choices gain influence, not through coercion but through example. Individuals who demonstrate discipline in their lives gain admiration, not through demands but through demonstration. India's discipline commanded attention because it revealed competence. Your discipline, if cultivated, will do the same in your own world. And when arrogance inevitably collapses around you, discipline will remain, standing steady, unshaken, and undeniable.